Matthew watched the city from the height of his glass penthouse, as if he were above everyone. The mirrored buildings reflected his own coldness, reminding him that he had achieved everything through discipline and profits. Inside his private office, no family photos or personal mementos broke the luxurious monotony. Only figures, contracts, and screens with graphs were his true daily companions. Matthew's routine was meticulously calculated. He woke at 5, trained with a personal coach, read reports while drinking coffee served by discreet staff. Nothing outside of his control was permitted. Power made him feel invincible, immune to the suffering of others. His eyes no longer saw people, only resources to be used or discarded. In his companies, thousands of employees depended on the decisions made in his meetings, but to Matthew, they were just numbers on spreadsheets. When he needed to cut costs, he did so without hesitation, believing the market demanded coldness. What for some meant unemployment, hunger, or despair, for him was simply efficiency. The newspapers portrayed him as a business genius, an Iron Man who was not shaken by external pressures. His public image was impeccable, a respected billionaire, a collector of awards, and owner of an enviable fortune. But behind the facade, there was a silent loneliness that he refused to acknowledge. The few who had ever tried to get emotionally close to him gave up early. Matthew believed feelings were weaknesses. Even his own impoverished childhood, marked by hardship, had been buried under layers of numbers. He never again allowed hunger or vulnerability to have a place in his life. But on that particular day, something unexpected began to crack his armor. Matthew was preparing for a surprise visit to one of his factories, not out of interest in the workers, but to personally verify production numbers. For him, direct contact was just a tool of intimidation and control. As his driver navigated his armored car, Matthew reviewed reports on a tablet. Everything seemed under absolute control. The streets sped by the window, but he didn't care about the people walking on them. In the billionaire's mind, the outside world was just a distant backdrop, irrelevant to his priorities. When he arrived at the factory, his presence caused a stir. Employees hurried to line up, nervous, adjusting their wrinkled uniforms. Matthew didn't greet anyone. He just looked on in silence, projecting authority and fear. To them, he was an unreachable entity, someone who decided destinies with a simple gesture. The inspection followed the usual pattern: dry questions, calculating looks, no display of humanity. But as he prepared to leave, something off-script caught his attention. A child's voice, coming from an unlikely corner, caught his attention with a firm tone. Matthew, who was used to being untouchable, turned around in surprise. And in that moment, his eyes met those of a skinny boy, just 8 years old. The child wasn't trembling. He didn't look away. In his eyes, he carried something Matthew hadn't seen in a long time: pure courage. If a simple question can shake a billionaire's heart, imagine how many more transformative stories we have to tell. Subscribe now and follow every emotion with us. The boy approached slowly, ignoring the frightened looks from the adults trying to stop him. His steps were small, but carried a silent strength. Intrigued, Matthew stood still, watching this unexpected gesture. It was rare for anyone to have the audacity to cross the invisible barrier that always separated him from others. The boy, in simple, worn-out clothes, stopped in front of him and lifted his chin. The employees whispered, fearing repercussions, but the child didn't seem to care. In a firm voice, he asked,
Why did you take the bread off our table?" The silence that followed was crushing, as if the world had stopped. For a moment, Matthew thought he must have misheard. The boldness of the question hit him like a punch out of nowhere. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a child. Irritated, he tried to hide his discomfort behind his cold, haughty expression. "The decisions I make are for the good of the company. The market is competitive, and we need to cut costs to survive. It was just a necessity of the system." The boy didn't look away, as if the answer made no sense to him. In the background, his mother, Clara, tried to pull him back, ashamed and fearful. But Gabriel, steady, remained in front of the billionaire. The child's innocence mixed with an unexpected courage, creating an unbearable weight for Matthew. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but it left everyone in shock. For the employees, seeing the boy stand up to the boss seemed unthinkable. For Matthew, however, something inside him began to stir, even as he tried to suppress it. The question kept echoing like a hammer blow. As he left the factory, he walked quickly toward his car, keeping a stern expression. But inside, there was a discomfort he couldn't explain. Those words, spoken with such simplicity, haunted him as if they were impossible to silence. And for the first time in many years, Matthew felt a real crack in his emotional armor. It wasn't just a question, it was a mirror forcing him to see what he had always refused to see.
In that moment, without admitting it to anyone, he realized something inside him had changed forever. The armored car moved along the city avenues, but Matthew didn't see the lit-up buildings. His mind was trapped by that question, so simple, yet so devastating. With each silent repetition, the boy's words gained more strength, like blades cutting through the armor he had built up over the years. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just a boy who had no idea how the market worked. He mentally repeated corporate speeches, trying to convince himself he had done the right thing. But no justification could erase the feeling that he had just looked truth in the eye. In the dark reflection of the window, he saw his own rigid face, aged and tired. He remembered being the boy's age, and on many nights going to sleep hungry. His mother would improvise meager meals, promising that better days would come. Those memories, which he had buried under millions of dollars, came back with overwhelming force. Matthew clenched his fists, angry at his own weakness. He couldn't allow an anonymous boy to shake his conviction. After all, he had built an empire precisely by being ruthless. But the contradiction ate away at him. How could he have forgotten where he came from? The driver, accustomed to his boss's silence, didn't dare speak. Inside the car, only the muffled sound of the engine echoed. The atmosphere seemed to suffocate Matthew, as if the air were too heavy to breathe. It was in that instant he noticed something strange. His eyes were burning. A single, solitary tear rolled silently down his face. Surprised, he quickly wiped it away with anger, as if it were an unforgivable weakness. But he couldn't stop the next ones. For the first time in 20 years, Matthew was crying. Each tear seemed to carry not just the boy's question, but also the voices of all the workers he had laid off without looking them in the eye. The weight of those decisions, once diluted in spreadsheets, now fell upon him like an unbearable burden. Deep down, he felt small. He realized that his fortune, his jets and yachts, meant nothing when faced with the simplicity of a meal denied to a family. What was all the gold worth if it cost a child their hunger? When he finally arrived home, Matthew didn't go to the luxurious living room or his office. He locked himself in his bedroom and stared at the dark ceiling. He couldn't sleep. Gabriel's question echoed like a ghost that would not leave him in peace. The next morning dawned gray, but Matthew didn't notice.
He sat at the breakfast table where there were artisanal breads, fine cheeses, and imported fruits. The feast felt like an affront. He looked at all and remembered Gabriel's small hands, asking about the bread that was missing from his table.
He pushed the plate away, his appetite gone. The memory of his childhood came back sharper. He remembered the time he had to split a single loaf of bread with his mother and siblings. That experience had motivated him to never be vulnerable again. But ironically, in the process of escaping poverty, he had become indifferent to the very pain he once knew. That morning, Matthew canceled his appointments. He ordered reports on every layoff from the past 5 years. As he read the names, each line felt like a weight. They weren't just records. They were lives stripped of their dignity. He felt his heart tighten as he realized how many Claras and Gabrielles were on that list. He decided to act. He ordered that Clara be rehired immediately, with back pay for the months she had missed. But even as he signed the order, he knew it was just a drop in the ocean. The pain he felt didn't lessen. The problem was much bigger than a single case. Matthew then did the unthinkable. He called his financial advisor and ordered the sale of his most expensive yacht. The advisor was stunned, asking if he was serious. Matthew replied curtly, "Sell everything that isn't essential. Starting today, we're creating a compensation fund for families affected by our decisions." The news spread quickly among his executives. That same day, his partners confronted him. They called him impulsive, irrational, weak. They argued that his stance would destroy investor confidence. But for the first time, Matthew wasn't intimidated by the cold vocabulary of the market. That night, sitting in the back seat of his car, Matthew reflected in silence. The armored vehicle, once a symbol of protection and power, now felt like a prison. The silence inside was deafening. Only one voice kept echoing: the boy who had asked about the bread. Matthew understood that the question wasn't just about one family's table. It was about all the tables he had thoughtlessly emptied in the name of profit. And if he didn't truly change, this ghost would follow him for the rest of his life. When he finally arrived home, he looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time, he didn't see the indestructible billionaire, but a tired, vulnerable man searching for redemption. The heavy night fell over the silent mansion. Matthew walked through the immense hallways, lit only by automatic lights. Every reflection in the mirror seemed to mock his loneliness. The man everyone saw as a business titan was being eaten away by a child's question. He sat in his library, surrounded by shelves of books he had never read. He pulled out an old, dusty photo album, forgotten at the back of a drawer. There were pictures of his childhood: simple clothes, a humble home, smiles that were forced despite the poverty. That reality, which he had denied for so long, now imposed itself with brutal clarity.
The memories hit him like a wave. He remembered the smell of stale bread that his mother would divide into tiny pieces so everyone could eat. He recalled the shame of going to school without lunch, making up excuses to hide his hunger. In a way, little Gabriel was a reflection of who he used to be. Matthew closed the album firmly, but the lump in his throat didn't go away. He realized how far he had drifted from his roots. While chasing wealth to never feel hungry again, he had ended up feeding a cycle that condemned others to the same suffering. The irony was cruel. The weight on his conscience kept him from sleeping. He walked to the balcony and looked out at the lit-up city. Every point of light represented a life.
How many of those lights had been extinguished by his decisions? The question turned into an accusation, growing more unbearable by the minute. In the silence of the night, Matthew made a vow to himself. He would do something, not just to quiet his own pain, but because he finally understood that his power had a greater purpose. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about profits. He was thinking about making things right. At dawn, he gathered his closest team. He asked for detailed reports on every workforce reduction carried out in recent years. The executives, confused, asked why the sudden obsession. He simply replied, "I need to understand the scale of the damage I've caused." For hours, Matthew read name after name. Each entry seemed to scream up at him from the pages. They weren't just statistics. They were stories, families, interrupted dreams. The moral weight grew heavier with each page. When he finished, he knew he could no longer look away. The iron-willed billionaire was crumbling, and in his place stood a man willing to change. But how could he turn remorse into concrete action? That would be his new battle. At dawn, he gathered his closest team. He asked for detailed reports on every workforce reduction carried out in recent years. The executives, confused, asked why the sudden obsession. He simply replied, "I need to understand the scale of the damage I've caused." For hours, Matthew read name after name. Each entry seemed to scream up at him from the pages. They weren't just statistics. They were stories, families, interrupted dreams. The moral weight grew heavier with each page. When he finished, he knew he could no longer look away. The iron-willed billionaire was crumbling, and in his place stood a man willing to change. But how could he turn remorse into concrete action? That would be his new battle. The next morning, Matthew called in his financial advisor. He ordered Clara's, Gabriel's mother's, immediate reinstatement with full compensation for the months she had missed. The surprised advisor asked if he should treat it as an exception. Matthew replied firmly, "It's not an exception, it's just the beginning." The news reached Clara quickly. She couldn't believe it when she got the call. Suspicious, she thought it must be some kind of mistake. When written confirmation arrived with guarantees of compensation, she cried with relief. Gabriel, happy, hugged his mother, unaware that his question had started something much bigger. But Matthew wasn't satisfied. Rehiring one employee wasn't enough compared to the mountain of affected lives. He needed a bigger gesture, something to show this wasn't just an isolated act of charity, but true restitution. That's when he made a radical decision. He called his advisor and ordered the sale of his private jet and luxury yacht. The advisor tried to argue, saying those assets were status symbols. Matthew cut him off. Symbols of vanity. I want to turn them into something useful.
The money from the sale would be used to create a support fund for families impacted by his mass layoffs. The fund wouldn't just provide handouts. It would include job placement and training programs. Matthew wanted to restore people's dignity, not just give them charity. His executive team was shocked by the news. During a tense meeting, his partners questioned his sanity. They called him impulsive, accused him of weakening the company's image. But Matthew stood his ground with a calmness that surprised even himself. "I spent years believing wealth was what I accumulated. Now I see that wealth is what I give back." His words left the room in absolute silence, even if there was no agreement. That night, alone in his mansion, Matthew felt a strange peace. It wasn't joy, but a sense of being on the right path. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a prisoner of his own success. However, he knew his decision would come with a price. The market doesn't forgive those who challenge its rules. The fight was just beginning, and Matthew would have to face not only his own ghosts, but also the system that had crowned him. The meeting room, located on the top floor of a glass skyscraper, felt more tense than ever. Matthew's partners and executives were lined up around the table with cold, distrustful looks. The news about the sale of the yacht and private jet had already spread, and the decision to create a support fund for laid-off families was causing outrage among them. One of the senior partners raised his voice. "Have you lost your mind, Matthew? Our company has always been an example of strength. Now you're turning us into a laughingstock. The market has no respect for sentimentality." The words hung in the heavy air like sharp accusations. Matthew remained calm but firm. He looked at each of them before responding. "I spent years believing that being respected meant being feared. But I've learned that true respect only exists when our decisions build people up, not tear them down. I won't go back on this." The silence that followed was deafening. The executives exchanged glances, torn between disbelief and anger. Some were already whispering about withdrawing their support from him on the board. Matthew knew he was becoming isolated, but he didn't back down. His conviction was stronger than his fear of loss. After the meeting, newspapers were already running headlines about the sudden transformation of billionaire Matthew. Some columnists called him a hypocrite, trying to clean up his image. Others called him a bold visionary. Public opinion was split, but his name had never been more talked about.
That same night, Clara received the official news of her reinstatement. As she hugged Gabriel, she cried with gratitude. The boy smiled and said, "See, Mom, he heard us." The simplicity of his words stood in stark contrast to the powerful intrigues unfolding behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Matthew walked alone through his penthouse. The city glittered at his feet, but he no longer felt like a conqueror. For the first time, he felt human. And it was precisely this humanity that frightened those around him. Deep down, he knew his fight wouldn't just be about spreadsheets or contracts. It was against an entrenched mindset, an entire system driven by greed. And by confronting it, he was discovering that his greatest wealth would also be his greatest vulnerability. The following days brought storms. Investors began calling in a panic, fearing stock prices would plummet due to Matthew's emotional decisions. Market analysts accused him of compromising the company's competitiveness. Every media interview became a minefield. During a press conference, a reporter asked sarcastically, "Are you trying to buy your own conscience?" Matthew took a deep breath before responding. "If that were possible, I would have done it sooner. But you can't buy a conscience. It wakes up. And when it does, it demands restitution." The phrase went viral, further dividing public opinion. To some, he was a fraud. To others, he was finally showing himself to be human. But within the company, the pressure mounted. The board began meeting secretly to discuss removing him as chairman. Matthew could feel the hostility in every hallway. Former allies avoided his gaze. Whispers turned into veiled accusations. The elite who once revered him now treated him like a traitor. Still, he stood firm, like someone crossing a battlefield knowing there was no turning back. One night, on his way home, he received a call from Clara. With emotion in her voice, she thanked him for the opportunity to return to work and told him how much happier Gabriel was. "You gave us back more than a job. You gave us back hope." Her words were a comfort amid the storm. But the joy was short-lived. The next morning, Matthew read a devastating headline. Trusted partner accuses Matthew of self-promotion. Relief fund is a fraud. Confidential documents had been leaked, twisted to tarnish his reputation. The betrayal hit him hard. Someone he had trusted had decided to destroy him to protect corporate interests. The war was no longer just moral. It had become political and personal. Matthew knew that by choosing the path of change, he had positioned himself against the very system that had fed him. and the system was willing to crush him to survive.
Yet as he looked out the window of his armored car that night, he didn't feel defeated. Clara's words and Gabriel's smile were his compass. He was ready to pay whatever price was necessary. Matthew began visiting the factory more frequently, but this time not to intimidate or demand results. He wanted to understand the workers' reality firsthand. He walked among the machinery, shook calloused hands, and listened to stories he once would have considered irrelevant. Each account reflected the lives he had helped shape, for better or for worse. During one of these visits, he met Clara on her break. She seemed uncomfortable speaking with him, but her gratitude was evident. Gabriel, curious, approached with a smile. Holding a sketchbook, the boy showed colorful drawings of his family, always gathered around a table full of food. Matthew was moved by the child's artwork. He asked Gabriel what he wanted to be when he grew up. The boy answered without hesitation, "I want to own a factory, but one that never takes bread off anyone's table." The innocence and certainty in his words touched Matthew's heart in a way no board meeting ever had. Slowly, an unlikely friendship began to form. Clara, though still cautious, sensed something genuine in his change. Gabriel, in turn, began to see in Matthew a figure resembling the father he had lost years earlier. The billionaire, lonely in his mansion, found in them a piece of the family he had never had. Meanwhile, the media remained divided. Headlines alternated between billionaire hypocrisy and business revolution. Matthew read everything in silence, without responding to the criticism. He had discovered that his greatest response lay not in words, but in the actions he would take from then on. One quiet evening, he invited Clara and Gabriel to dinner at his home. The table, once the setting for lonely meals, now came alive with simple conversation and laughter. For the first time in decades, Matthew felt he was not alone. However, this newfound happiness would soon be tested. That same night, a partner sent a cryptic message. "Be careful, Matthew. You're messing with forces bigger than you realize." His friendship with Clara and Gabriel had become an emotional fortress, but also a vulnerability. He knew his enemies wouldn't hesitate to use it against him. Matthew now had more to lose, but he also had something real to fight for.
The next morning, headlines exploded like bombs. A detailed dossier accused Matthew of manipulating the relief fund for personal gain. Confidential documents, distorted and taken out of context, had been leaked to the press. Matthew's name was at the center of a scandal.
The reaction was immediate. Investors pulled their support, stock prices plummeted, and columnists accused him of being a fraud. The man who was trying to make amends was now being portrayed as an opportunist. Matthew recognized the hallmark of the betrayal. It had come from within the board itself. At an emergency meeting, he faced his partners. One of them, until then a trusted friend, all but confessed, "You've changed, Matthew, and change threatens our survival. We can't let a romantic ideal destroy what we've built." The coldness in his words hurt more than any public attack. Matthew left the room in silence, his eyes burning. He didn't respond. He knew that every step he took to correct his mistakes was moving him further away from the world he had dominated for decades. And paradoxically, it was in this distance that he was finding meaning. That evening, Clara called to offer her support. Gabrielle, in the background, asked if Matthew was okay. He replied, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been better, but I've also been worse." The boy insisted, "Don't give up, okay?" That simple phrase acted like emotional armor against the storm. In the days that followed, Matthew avoided interviews. He preferred strategic silence while he prepared his next move. He knew he couldn't fight the system with words alone. He needed bigger actions, ones that would silence even the fiercest critics. However, the betrayal had left deep scars. The man who once trusted his business colleagues now saw enemies in every face. The elite who once revered him were now plotting his downfall. Yet amid the chaos, he found a thread of hope. Clara and Gabrielle believed in him, and perhaps it was precisely this trust that would push him to face the hardest blow yet to come. Matthew received the news like a stab wound. The company's board had approved, in his absence, a new wave of mass layoffs. More than 2,000 employees would be let go under the justification of strategic realignment. To him, this wasn't just a number. It meant thousands of empty dinner tables, thousands of Gabrielles asking why their bread was taken away. Furious, he called an extraordinary meeting. He walked into the room and stared down each director. "You are destroying families in the name of statistics," his voice thundered. But the cold stares showed no remorse. One partner replied, "Don't confuse a company with a charity, Matthew. The market demands sacrifices." The billionaire felt his heart tighten. It was like looking at a reflection of the man he had been for decades. He realized that not long ago he would have said those exact same words. Now, however, they sounded monstrous. Matthew tried to block the decision, but he discovered his power on the board was being slowly eroded. Rigged votes, secret alliances, calculated betrayals, everything was conspiring to isolate him. He was no longer the untouchable figure everyone had once revered.
As he left the meeting, Clara was waiting for him in the company lobby. Tears were in her eyes, and she held a folder of documents in her hands. "They've already started sending out termination notices," she said, her voice trembling. Gabriel, standing beside her, looked at Matthew in silence, waiting for a response. In that moment, the weight of responsibility fell on him with even greater force. It wasn't enough to just repair past damages. He needed to prevent new injustices from being committed in his name. Back in the armored car, he stared at the city's reflection in the dark windows. His decision was made. He would not allow the system he helped build to destroy more lives. But he knew the price would be high. Deep down, he feared that if he didn't win this battle, he would be remembered as a man who tried to change but failed in the face of the market's merciless machinery. A few weeks later, the situation erupted completely. The government convened a public hearing to discuss the layoffs. Executives, workers, and the press packed the auditorium. Matthew, pressured from all sides, attended. He knew he would be exposed, but he had no choice. The board members' speeches were cold, filled with technical terms and economic justifications. The audience listened in silence, not fully understanding the elaborate language. To many, they were just words masking the harsh reality of hunger. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, the atmosphere grew tense. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and began in a firm voice. "For years, I believed I was a leader, but now I see I was just an accomplice in a system that destroys to enrich a few." His words caused murmurs, some of support, others of disapproval. Suddenly, a small voice echoed through the auditorium. Gabriel, sitting next to his mother, stood up bravely. His question cut through the room like lightning. "Why did you take the bread off our table?" The silence that followed was absolute. Matthew felt his legs weaken. The same question that had haunted him in private was now before everyone, with no possibility of escape. The eyes of the crowd turned to him, awaiting his response.
With tears in his eyes, the billionaire took a deep breath. His voice was choked with emotion as he said, "Because I forgot how to be human." The impact was devastating. Some cried, others applauded, but no one remained indifferent. The scene was broadcast live across the country. Within minutes, social media was flooded with videos of the child confronting the billionaire and the sincere response he had given. The fraud narrative they had tried to build against Matthew began to fall apart.
That night, alone at home, he realized the moment had been a turning point. There was no going back now. Gabriel's question had transformed from a personal torment into a national symbol. And Matthew knew his next move would have to be even more decisive. The packed auditorium was plunged into silence. After Gabriel's question, everyone waited for Matthew's reaction. He took a deep breath, discreetly wiped his eyes, and walked to the center of the stage. Each step felt incredibly heavy, but there was a new strength in his posture, the courage of someone with nothing left to hide. In a firm voice, he began, "For years, I hid my humanity behind reports and charts. I told myself they were just numbers, but those numbers had faces, families, dreams. I took bread from many tables, including this boy's table. Today, I don't speak as a billionaire, but as a man full of regret." The people in the front rows shifted in their seats, visibly moved. As he spoke, the cameras broadcast close-ups of his face, revealing the sincerity in every word. "I know many consider me a class traitor, but I ask, what kind of class celebrates profits at the expense of hunger?" The silence was broken by isolated applause, which quickly multiplied. Matthew raised his voice. "I can't erase the past, but I can transform the future. That's why I announce that I will not only maintain the relief fund, but I will also allocate part of my personal fortune to prevent every new unjust layoff. If necessary, I will sell everything I own. True wealth isn't what we accumulate, but what we give back." The audience erupted in applause. Clara cried, overcome with emotion, while Gabriel smiled proudly. Matthew's partners present in the auditorium clenched their fists in anger, realizing the speech had turned public opinion in his favor. When he finished, he felt immense relief. For the first time, there were no masks or strategies, just truth. The speech from the heart resonated not only there, but in every home watching on television. He knew, however, that he would still face fierce retaliation. But in that moment, he no longer feared losing wealth or status. He had discovered something infinitely more valuable: the freedom to be human. The impact was immediate. While crowds in the streets applauded him as a symbol of hope, the market reacted ruthlessly. His stocks plummeted, contracts were broken, and former allies declared open war. Matthew had become persona non grata among the powerful. In secret meetings, billionaires and influential politicians called him a class traitor. Some tried to buy his silence, offering favorable deals in exchange for abandoning the relief fund. He refused them all, even knowing the price would be devastating.
Just a few days later, newspapers announced that Matthew had lost controlling interest in his own company. In an aggressive move, the board had removed him from his position as chairman. The man who once ruled with absolute power was now seen as an outsider in the world he helped build. Despite the fall, Matthew didn't waver. He sold mansions, cars, and art collections. He channeled every penny into sustaining the fund and ensuring the layoffs were reversed. The press documented his transformation with astonishment. From an untouchable tycoon to a simple man dedicated to restoring dignity. With every family rehired, he felt the weight on his chest lighten. The smiles of workers returning home with renewed employment were a reward no profit could ever buy. Still, the material losses were painful, and the loneliness deepened. One evening, Clara and Gabriel came to visit him. They found him in a much more modest home, without luxury, but filled with peace. Gabriel hugged him and said, "You didn't lose anything. You gained us." The boy's words were like a balm, healing invisible wounds. Matthew understood he had traded power for purpose, fortune for meaning. It was a high price, but he had never felt so free. Yet he knew the battle wasn't over. The system remained powerful and vengeful, and his new mission would be to resist it, no longer as a billionaire, but as a transformed man. Months passed, and Matthew was no longer called the Iron Man. To some, he had lost his mind. To others, he had become a symbol of hope. His life, once surrounded by luxury and silence, was now defined by simple gestures and the impact he had on the families he once destroyed with cold decisions. His home, now a modest space, was always full of voices. Clara and Gabriel became constant presences, almost like family. Dinners that were once lonely were now lively, filled with conversations about dreams, the future, and possibilities. The emptiness of his mansion had been replaced by the real lives of people who mattered. During one of these gatherings, Gabriel showed him a new drawing. This time, it wasn't just the family gathered around the table. It showed Matthew sitting beside them, smiling, eating the same bread he had once taken away. The billionaire held the paper with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. Meanwhile, beyond his home, his example began to resonate. Other business owners, pressured by public opinion and inspired by his actions, created similar funds, rethinking their practices around layoffs and management. The movement, started by an innocent question, was turning into a wave of change. Matthew wasn't seeking recognition. When journalists approached him, he responded humbly, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just chose to listen to what I'd always ignored. A child's voice was stronger than all the numbers in my life." His words were repeated in newspapers and on television, touching thousands of hearts. Despite the positive response, some billionaires continued to attack him, calling him weak and defeated. But Matthew no longer cared. He had discovered that the real defeat would have been continuing to live without seeing the humanity behind his actions. During his last visit to the factory, he was greeted with applause. Workers who once feared him now saw him as someone who finally understood their reality. Gabriel ran to him and proudly held his hand. Clara, moved, simply said, "Thank you for choosing to be different." In that moment, Matthew realized he no longer needed jets, mansions, or the approval of the elite. His greatest wealth was right there. Restored trust, genuine respect, and the chance to have made a difference. As he walked among the workers, he felt his story was just beginning. And deep down, he knew that Gabriel, with his courage and innocence, would be the continuation of this legacy. The man who was once a prisoner of his own power now understood true wealth lies in giving back to the world twice what it gives us: love, dignity, and hope. Matthew's life changed forever with one question, and perhaps the next story that will change yours is right here. Sign up now and join this journey of emotions that touch hearts and transform lives.